Hey folks, it's John from AIFA Alcoholic again. Today's conversation is with Whitney W. They are the creator of the Sober Rabbit comics. And if you haven't heard of them, you should hear of them. Great comics. It was great to sit down with them and talk about sobriety and recovery and all of the things that come with it, all of the mundane minutia, which is the inspiration for the comics. We talked about their active alcoholism, their sobriety, and the things that bring us to where we are now, the unexpected things. We talked about pain management, dealing with chronic pain and prescription drugs in sobriety. We talked about art, and we talked about taking care of each other and asking for help. So, without further ado, here is my conversation with the creator of Sober Rabbit Comics, Whitney W. Whitney, thank you very much for doing this. I appreciate your time. I was turned on to you by Mishka Shubali. I took his writing class earlier this summer.
Oh, how cool.
And in the writing sample that I had given him, there were some illustrations. And as we discussed going further with my project, one of the things that he turned me on to were your comics. And
wow.
as like, here's one approach, because ultimately what I was working on was going to have to be scrapped and redone in one fashion or another. And that was one of them. He's like, look at Sober Rabbit as a template for, sobriety cartoons if you're going to do illustrations. So that's kind of something that I've been thinking about, and I've been following you ever since. That was in June.
Oh wow.
And it's great stuff.
Oh, thank you so much. First of all, the fact that Mishka knows who I am and knows my art, I'm fangirling a little bit. No, that's so cool. And then that's thank you. That's really flattering. The fact that anyone reads it at all tickles the hell out of me. So anytime anyone has been like, yeah, I read one panel, I'm like, oh, you did? So that's so flattering. Thank you.
Well, yeah, and I think that the thing that I like, and it's in the tagline or the description, where in one part of your website where it says there's a lot of talk about getting sober but not staying sober. And I know that our podcast and our listeners, I mean, that's what we do, because we've gotten sober, right? We have Jerry and I have kicked the habits, as they say, and moved on from that, but it still creeps in the back of your head. And then there's all kinds of other things to deal with, right? There's like all of the eating disorders and all of the body dysmorphia from the eating disorders, and all of the social
and family
anxieties.
trauma.
Family trauma, right? So and we can always have constant discussions about where alcoholism comes from. And I think that there are many different places, but I think that all of these things exacerbate it regardless of where it comes from, right? So I think that is something that is that I find in your comics, and is extraordinarily helpful to look at these very heavy situations with a little bit of humor. And it doesn't hurt to have cute animals talking about these things, right?
Definitely. No, and
go ahead.
I was just gonna say, I have said this before about the comic, but part of the reason why I started it was I think that there's tons of narratives, just whether that's in comics or movies. I mean, I think even video games address it now, but there's not a lot about staying sober. There's a lot of rock bottom type stories out in the world. And I think that even sometimes people's first introduction to an artist is like a drunk memoir, like what's their story? What's the worst stuff that happened? And for me, it's way harder as a sober person now to find stories about prolonged sobriety, sustained sobriety, because I think that there's a salaciousness to if somebody relapses, if somebody tries a different substance and breaks what they previously thought of, as sobriety. So anyway, that was sort of the impetus to me to write about, okay, well, what happens when you have a couple of years,
Sure. So, and one of the things I like to ask people on here, one of my first questions is, what is your earliest memory of alcohol? Either not necessarily as drinking it, but was it something that was in the household growing up, or how long have you known about it as a substance?
Yeah, it's funny. I'm currently visiting my parents in Arkansas. I'm in my hometown right now. And whenever I talk about alcoholism, I often talk about how my dad owned a bar when I was a kid. And so I was around drunk adults from my earliest memories. And then, when I was a really little kid, we would go to the lake and hang out with his bar friends. And my dad, hung out with industry peeps, with service industry people. And so as a little kid, drinking wasn't a mystery to me. I knew that adults drank and got drunk. It was kind of old hat to me, as a preteen. And I didn't ever think that I would drink alcohol kind of based on how my parents' friends acted. There were fights, there were, like disagreements, and they fell asleep in their chair. It was very like off-putting stuff, which is why when I started drinking in high school, I didn't think that I would be that way. So when I was a little kid, I just thought, oh, well, adults drink and then they get drunk sometimes, and other times they get sad. And my parents, because my dad owned a bar and, it was like business to them, they really weren't drinkers. And they weren't, that wasn't really part of their life other than the business side of things of running a bar. So I had a very like bartender dad schedule as a little kid. But I wasn't someone who was told like, never touch this, or, drinking is a sin. I just really, that wasn't my upbringing at all. It was more like, well, it exists and you can try it, but it's kind of not our thing.
I feel like bar owners that aren't alcoholics or don't drink in that way are few and far between. At least all of the owners many of the owners that I've worked with, I bartended for about 12, 13 years. They were there because they thought it was a good way for them to drink for free.
Yeah, absolutely. So. Yeah, no, and it's not really a bad idea if you're an alcoholic and you put it that way. Well, I'm at work. Why don't I do what I love?
Right.
Yeah, and that just wasn't my, experience as a kid.
And then, okay. But it was a good experience. I mean, at least, it was not traumatic other than you seeing these other adults who were, like you said, falling asleep in the chair, getting into fights. You're like, yeah, this is a warning sign. So what changed in high school that made you think, oh, well, maybe I should try this?
Well, I think that even when I was a kid, there was this awareness of like, oh, there is some danger associated with this. Like I had known as a kid that my dad had several tussles with drinking people, with people who are on drugs, that it was a physical danger to him sometimes. And so when I was a little kid, I sort of thought, okay, well, drinking is just something that adults do, all the adults that I know anyway. And, I guess if I ever try it, like, whatever, I just don't want to be that way. And I had, cousins and other people growing up. I feel like in Arkansas anyway, it was fairly normal to drink when you're 12, 13, 14 at the lake, have a beer, not have like a mixed drink, but, just like have a beer because it's hot, and so I didn't really start drinking until the end of high school. I had a really bad breakup. And then one of the first things that happened to me God, like maybe the second time that I drank was sexual violence. That was something that happened real early in my drinking career in a way that I didn't regard as trauma at the time. You know, I sort of regarded it as like, oh, well, if you're drinking, then this is just a thing that happens. And, you know, in particular, oh, I shouldn't have put myself in that position. And that's just kind of like the Southern spin on sexual violence. You know, I grew up in a place that taught abstinence only sex education. I had friends who had had bad things happen to them of that variety. And, you know, it was just sort of like thought of as like, oh, well, you know, you were where you shouldn't have been. And so of course this happened. And so I did what a lot of people I've since learned did when that sort of thing happened, which was I pushed it down and thought, okay, well, if I adopt this kind of party person persona, then I probably won't get hurt again. And people will think that I'm so tough that they wouldn't try me. Do you know what I mean? And the more I've talked to sober people, regardless of gender, which is a big shock to me, the more I found that a lot of people had really adverse sexual experiences in their first couple of years of drinking. And that, for me anyway, you know, made me drink more. And that was like you know, like a coping mechanism that I didn't even see as a coping mechanism. So that was kind of the first thing that turned the gear from like, oh, this is a fun thing that I can do with my friends, and you know, to kind of turn off the self-censoring voice in my head and be less inhibited, to, oh, this is a thing that if I drink this, I won't think about that bad stuff. And I didn't realize then how damaging that was, and that was, you know, trauma. So yeah.
And to hold on to those things for so long. And I'm always, again, we talk about trauma, sexual violence. I dealt with a lot of abuse from my father, and all of these things, and we just kind of roll around in our head and we create this whole other story about it. And like you said, the things that we are taught, that I was in the wrong place at the wrong time, or that somehow I was responsible for these things when I was not the person, you know, I was not the person who was enacting the violence. I was just a child. And but years, decades even later, we're still thinking in our head, gosh, if I had done this. And to not process that and see that the responsibility was not ours, that we were, you know, the victim in those situations, is, I think, one of the huge epiphanies of sobriety that certainly for me came. And so in high school you're drinking, and now it's a coping mechanism, and is it still, I mean, are we still having fun? Are we?
Well, that's the thing that, you know, you have all these revelations in sobriety, you know, or I have anyway, whether those are just like, oh, I was operating on this wrong idea. You know, for me, that's like a key sobriety skill of like, a sponsor phrased it to me as like, you know, what was the wrong idea that you were telling yourself? And I think that that's an amazing way to be like, you weren't bad or stupid. You know, you formed this safe idea of, oh, it's just that I was bad. And then that excuses, you know, all these other people in your life. But so, you know, I think that there were big rationalizations happening. I had always been a kid that was very sensitive little artist. And I was someone who was just very Southern and apologetic, you know? And so I'm the kind of person even now where like, if somebody bumps into me, I'm like, oh, sorry. But I realized that the drinking helped with the anxiety and the depression that I was having. It took me until probably my second year of sobriety to realize that I'm someone who has anxiety. You know, I always thought that the depressive tendencies were very clear. You know, when I was in junior high and high school, I had the kind of depression where it was hard for me to get out of bed. I didn't eat much, just classic textbook depression, which I'm sure had, to do with puberty as well. But so the drinking that I started as a fun party thing actually helped with, mental health stuff. And that's something else that I think is true in sobriety, that these mechanisms that you used to have, and maybe, for me anyway, drinking helped. Like, it helped me early on. And so the partying was fun, and I feel like at the time I thought, oh, well, I'm not very good at this, but I like it. Like, I'm someone who like my biggest problem drinking was that I wouldn't pass out. And so I would be partying well into the night, and that's kind of how I wound up drinking with people that were older than me, because the teenagers my age weren't experienced, but the seasoned alcoholics were like, pull up a chair. So I feel like in high school and even early into college, it was fun, and it was framed as, this is a fun thing, and if you fall down and bump your head and throw up a little, that's normal, which now as an adult, I'm just like, oh my God, like, teenagers, don't do this. It doesn't have to be so vomity, but like as a kid, I was like, this is great. This is how it goes.
It doesn't have to be so vomity. Yes, I think that's...
It really doesn't.
It definitely, it's what an amazing thing to look back and be like, yeah, it was just normal. I had a friend, we had a friend who we would be standing outside of bars smoking cigarettes, and he would go kind of walk off a few feet over to the gutter, throw up, standing up there, and then come back and continue. And that was something that just like, I could never do that, because for me, vomiting was such a traumatic experience. Like, I wasn't able to, as they say, boot and rally. But because I would get to the point where it would be so severe that I would burst all the blood vessels underneath my eyes. And so it would look like I'd have two black eyes the next day. And so I did everything I could not to, but yeah, so it doesn't have to be so vomity. And now I couldn't even imagine if I was, there would be something truly, truly wrong, and in need of assistance, in need of attention.
No, totally. Have you gotten sick in sobriety and been mad that you've thrown up? Because like, that's something that's happened to me, where it's like, I thought I got all this behind me. Like, I think I've done my time.
Right. No, and I've had a few sicknesses where I'm just like, gosh, this is what, because I'd forgotten what a hangover was like, and I'd wake up and I'm like, my head hurts and I'm achy and I'm nauseous, and I was like, oh God, that's right. So in a small way, a good reminder to not do those things.
Absolutely.
So as the drinking continues through college and so on and so forth, and I don't want to dwell again too much time on that, but were there some pivotal points in that drinking that led to, like, maybe were there multiple rock bottoms? Did you just have the one that was like, boom, I need to quit?
Yeah, no. There were plenty. I sort of describe my drinking as like, I kept finding a lower bottom. And I think a lot of people say something similar of like, you think this lowest thing is really low, and it's lower. In college, I went to school and started out as an English major, but then quickly wound up with the crazy theater kids because they drank like I did. And so I bring that up a lot because I was operating under this idea that to be artistic meant that you had to be this mess. Like, the more conflict, like the more, complicated situations you're in, that's great for your art. And I feel like that was something that was very tied into my college partying, of like, we also had this set schedule where you would rehearse and it was intense, and you didn't eat all the time, and you bled theater. It was very unhealthy. But so I did that, and it sort of was kind of toxic as a schedule, because there would be rehearsal, and then you would put on the show, and then you would party, and it would just do that over and over again, for many semesters. until I graduated. And the thing about that is I figured out how to make it functional for me, which is you have to hold your shit together just long enough to, be on stage or to get the lights going or whatever. And then afterwards you're rewarded with partying.
Yeah.
And so that sort of set in motion this idea of like, oh, if I can contain my drinking to the weekends, or if I can contain it until I'm alcoholic, because reasons. Because I'm not in jail all the time, or because I'm not kicked out of school, then that means that I'm not an alcoholic. And now I look back, constantly say, well, I'm not an alcoholic because I take their inventory, like any listeners. But but yeah, that was the thought that I constantly had of like, oh, well, this isn't a problem because, fill in the blank. And so I kept having, I would screw up opportunities for jobs, I would screw up opportunities for parts, miss deadlines, and so that doesn't seem like the biggest end of the world stuff, but the result was that I low-key missed out on so much stuff and so many friendships and so many alliances in the arts because I was a mess. And maybe I was a functional mess, but I was still a mess all through college and all through my 20s, really.
Yeah. What was the yeah, I do know the idea of missed opportunities. I still have, there was a friend of mine who I was with backstage at a big rock concert, and he was close friends with the band The Killers.
Oh,
and
yeah.
he had worked with them and he knew them. I went to high school with the drummer. We were never close, but and this is not to say, this is not to make me sound important. I'll in a second you'll understand. But and I was so drunk, and I was just so like, I'm here and we're backstage, and we're like, just, I'm having the blast. And he said something to me. We were talking about meeting people. We were talking about meeting important people. And in radio, this was something that I was passionate about at the time, was being a DJ on the radio and stuff like that. And he's like, John, I would totally introduce you to these people if you weren't so drunk.
Oh God.
And like that, just inside, like a little part of me died, that sort of, I missed that opportunity that had I not been drunk. And then this was another one, was a guy that I respect, a bartender at the time, and he owns his own bar, and he said, John, I would totally hire sober John, but I wouldn't hire drunk John. And I was like, oh God. And again, a little bit more of me died, right? These people were just being honest. And I think that they didn't mean any, like, they were not trying to hurt me, but they were just like, this is not going to happen. So I completely relate with the missed opportunities and trying to drag myself away from living in regret, because it's not helpful now. What was the last mess that you got yourself that brought you to sobriety?
Well, I went to school for theater. I wound up dropping out as a senior. I had a lot of eating disorder related problems on top of alcoholism and drug addiction. I was just unwell. And then I was in the visual arts world for a little bit and kind of failed up there a little bit. But then I went back and finished my degree at the Maine University in Fayetteville. And just at the end of that, I discovered stand-up comedy. And that was the gateway drug to full-blown alcoholism. Because, similar to service industry stuff, talk about drinking for free, talk about like being with people that are just as poisonously alcoholic as you are. So I was very invested in theater and visual arts. And then I was like, oh, wait, stand-up is way easier. And so in 2013, I was like, I'm in, and I threw down and was a stand-up comedian and started doing my own show, and then started traveling, and then started getting into festivals. And there's also another toxic thing where it's like, that's a great world to be an active addict, because it's nonstop socializing. It's being at bars 24/7. It's only knowing service industry people. And so, long story short, I moved to Chicago in 2015, and I did all the same things that I did as a Southern drinking road comic, except in much higher stakes of like, okay, like now do this in a city, 4 million people, and it just kept getting more dangerous and more dangerous. And, I have all the war stories where I got hurt, I hurt other people, like, of course those exist. But for me, the demoralizing stuff was really the quiet sadness of, I'm ruining my life, I'm ruining my relationships. And so my final night of drinking in August 2016 was a great night. I saw Maria Bamford, one of my favorite comedians. I hung out with my friends, a friend of mine opened, like it was just great, green lights. And I still drank like it was the end of the world. And so I tell a lot of people, you don't necessarily have to have this story where you crashed your car and you lost somebody and you ruined every opportunity. It can just be the last straw in a series of huge fuck ups. So for me, I woke up the next day, and instead of being like, shucks, like I screwed up again, I was throwing up blood. It had been a couple days. I had called an Uber to completely the wrong part of the city. I had walked for miles to the wrong place. I mean, it was just a mess. And the thing that was terrifying was that night wasn't really unlike any other night for me. It wasn't like I had been beaten down until I had to change something. It was that I had been living my life like that for so many years that like I just sort of wore out, So I woke up the next day in my gross garden level moldy apartment and was like, oh shit, this isn't going to kill me in the future. This is going to kill me now. I was 29 and I had this vague notion in my head that I would need to quit in my 30s, which again is not what an average person thinks, I don't think, about drinking. And I was terrified and I was beaten down, and, the gift of desperation, as some people say. And that made me Google sober help meetings near me, help sober drinking, help me. And I'm just so lucky that like that hit at the right moment. You know what I mean? That I was willing to give something else a shot.
Yeah. I guess I had a similar moment too of it was there was a relationship that I had destroyed, but that 100% my fault. But there was this moment of like, all of this, I'm going to lose everything that I have, and I don't have that much, right? So there were a few good things that had happened, and I was like, that's gonna go away, and that's gonna go away, and that's gonna go away. And it was just that sort of, I what you call it, like a mid bottom, I didn't have a run-in with the law or anything like that. I didn't, there was nothing like that. But just that sort of slow, hazy epiphany that maybe something might have to change here, and nobody's coming to do it for me. Right.
And that's a terrifying thing, to be like, oh, I'm alone. It is mostly my fault. I am miserable, like it's just, I tell a lot of people, like, if you are miserable, it's okay to maybe not be miserable. You know what I mean? I thought at some point that I deserved it, like I was just I had messed things up so bad that I thought that I had deserved it and that it would stay that way. So.
Yeah. What did the Google search give you? What did you find that day?
Well, this is how bad I was in. When I lived in Arkansas, I swear to you, if I knew anybody that was in the program, they did not tell me. I had never been around sober people, and I think that's by virtue of being Southern. being Southern, being queer, being poor, all these things. I didn't know anybody that went to rehab. No close friends of mine. Nobody
Right.
really got better. People just sort of drank until they died, or used until they accidentally died. But so I had no recovery, anything in my life. And I had a friend that I was worried about before I moved. And as a last ditch effort to see if someone, not me, a drinker, could help this friend, I had looked up 12-step groups in Arkansas before I moved to Chicago. And this is so sad, but it's so true. Whenever I called them, I said, hey, I live in Fort Smith. I'm looking for help for my friends. Are there sober meetings here? Because I literally thought in my hometown that no one was sober. And they're like, yeah, no, we're here. And I was like, oh, okay, cool. And then I gave them this big story about my friend. And I'm sure the person sitting in the office was like, oh yeah, your friend.
Mm-hmm.
But so what I remembered, years later when I was in Chicago, was this person that I had spoken to in the 12-step office had no judgment. There was no judgment to their voice. There wasn't any, what did you do? Like in the way that someone who is always in trouble is expecting, the other shoe to fall. So when
Right.
I Googled sober help near me, meetings help, 12-step, there was a meeting really close to my apartment. And I thought, this is close enough to my apartment. This is in a couple of days. These people seem nice. They probably won't yell at me. And I feel like, there's the Paul F. Tompkins bit about how he led his whole life trying not to get yelled at. I think that was kind of me too. But so I wound up doing a thing that I had never done before, which was accepting help. And so I went to this meeting in a church, which blew my mind. I continue to be an atheist. I went to a church, and instead of being these old straight white guys that I thought were going to throw the Bible at me, because my only concept of 12-step groups was there's a higher power and it's kind of like church. That's just sort of like what I had gleaned from movies and that sort of thing. Instead, it was a lot of really funny, really bleak people sitting around a table, and they're like, you look like shit, do you want some help? And that was pretty much it. The mere fact that I didn't feel judged, that I didn't have anybody else that wanted to talk to me, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
That led me there, and I'm so glad I went.
I think that's such a good point. And I had never thought about it that way. It's just that these people, they're not here to judge me. And if I'm to be completely honest, my time in 12 steps have taught me that everybody's just there looking for help themselves.
Yeah.
There's not a lot of room for judgment. You know what I mean? That's not what people are interested in. And what a great thing. Oh, okay, yeah, they're not going to judge me because they're not I didn't hurt them. I didn't, I didn't yell at them. I didn't piss on the sidewalk in front of their bar. That was me.
I haven't swindled them yet.
Yeah, exactly. I haven't lied or cheated or stolen from them yet.
Totally.
So yeah, I mean, that's just a really good point that I've never heard vocalized. Well, so you went to a meeting?
Yeah, I went to a meeting, and I feel like the subsequent years of staying in the program and surrounding myself with sober people, it really opened me up to a lot of those wrong ideas I had, in that I thought that narcissism was like loving yourself and being like, I am the shit, I have all the answers. But I think that the kind of depression that I have had was sort of a similar self-absorption to, and anxiety as well, but of everybody's looking at me, everybody's afraid that I'm going to mess up, everybody's they're all judging me. And in reality, nobody really cares in your life. They really don't. Your family and friends, they love you, but whenever you walk into a group situation, nobody's thinking that person's weird, I'm judging. Maybe you have a split second judgmental thought of that's a dumb shirt, I hate the Big Bang Theory, whatever it is, but really nobody's monitoring you under a microscope. And I don't know why it is that I'm someone who has always been so self-conscious, but I realized that, these are damaged people too. These are people who have messed up their lives in some way. But the biggest thing that I got from the meeting that I still get to this day from Zoom meetings is, here's a room full of people who are working on themselves. And they are most of the time genuinely wanting to get better. And I can't think of another environment where that exists. Like, surely there's a support group of some other type where there's people that, you know, want to get better. There's therapy support groups, but, you know, walking into a meeting for alcoholics or for addicts is a unique experience, you know?
Yeah.
It's helpful.
Yeah. I mean, it's definitely, it is definitely a unique experience. And I agree with you 100%. And it's been a while since I've been to an actual meeting because of everything that's happened. And I can tell in my, you know, in myself, right? And I think the thing that I get from those meetings, or even on Zoom, which has not been my favorite, but has been, and I know a lot of people have loved it and have found it. And I know people who got sober in 2020 through Zoom meetings, which is amazing to me. But that being able to just sit there, and I'm not required to say anything, and I'm not required to necessarily participate. Now, I have learned that participation actually helps the healing process, and it's important. And if I don't feel like participating, that probably means I should participate more. But being able to just sit there, and even in those long, awkward silences where nobody says anything for minutes on end, you know, and you're like, this is weird. Like, well, why don't you say something, John? So, you're like, is anybody gonna say anything? Should I say something? Because is this not weird to everybody?
And I'm like I talk for money professionally, so as you do as well. So I feel like I have that, like, jump in and say something, and I have to sometimes buck that urge and just be like, man, for some people to be at the meeting for 60 minutes or an hour 15 and not drink is the win of the day. If you're sitting there not drinking and not using, you're crushing it. You know what I mean? Like, you really don't have to fill the silence. So I like that too. It's helpful.
Yeah. So you've been sober since August. So you just had a 5-year anniversary. So is that correct?
Did. Yeah. I just days ago celebrated 5 years, and
congratulations.
Thank you so much. You know, and just to say this, as I do on every anniversary, I'm someone who thought I would never get sober, who never thought that I would go to a damn meeting in a church, who never thought that I would be friends with people who are religious. You know, some of them I've met in the program, you know, all these things in my head, solid, written in stone, never. So the fact that I just celebrated 5 years, like, if you're thinking, I could never get sober, you probably could, you know?
You probably could. I mean, I think anybody could if they want it, and if they're interested in it, or even if you're just curious. You know, I went to my very first AA meeting. I was drunk as hell at like 8:00 in the morning. I had been drinking all night. Oh no. But I was like, and I talked to this guy on the phone, and I was drunk, and he wasn't on. That was an AA hotline. And I just stayed up, because that's what I would do alone in my apartment, is just drink until the sun came up and then pass out. And I remember I called a cab, and I paid the cab to stay there in the parking lot of the meeting.
Oh man.
Because I needed to have a way out. It was insane. It was just absolute insanity. And I don't remember if I left. I must have left early. It was all a haze, because like I said, I'd been drinking for like 8 hours, and then went to an AA meeting, and I was like, who are all these people? This is so fucked. I don't belong here.
It's like you're simultaneously like, I'm better and then worse than all of these people.
Yes. And then to come to the realization, like, this is a really good place to be. This is really helpful. I should come back here more often, you know?
Yes. Yeah. For real.
So 5 years sober. I do, obviously, the reason how I found you and what I found you for was this sober rabbit. And can you explain to me what the sober rabbit is?
Totally. Yeah. Well, it's funny, there's been so much that's happened in the past couple of years that it's hard for me sometimes to be like, wait, when did my life change? When did this? In 2019, I was having a bad time. I had been working in the corporate world in the daytime, and then being a touring comedian at night. And so that was a really like strange dichotomy, too. But I was sort of pushed out of the position that I'd had for a long time because of corporate restructuring, and moved to a different office, and my job changed. And so that was at the beginning of 2019. And then, in even more corporate restructuring, I was laid off very suddenly. My whole department was, it was a big shift. And I found myself without the safety net that I had gotten in my second month of sobriety. It was my first sober job. It was a good job, and I had never really had a big kid job like that because I, again, was an addict. But so 2019 was just very tumultuous. And then I had been unemployed for a couple months, and it was very scary. I wasn't sure that I could stay in Chicago. And I had found a new job at a company that I probably shouldn't name, but I'll give you a hint. They sell iPhones. So I was working at this big plush company, and I had just finished training and I had started the job in earnest when I was walking to a stand-up show at night. Or it was, I guess, almost night. I was walking down a street that I had walked down a million times before, and a tired nurse leaving work ran 2 stop signs and hit me mid-crosswalk, running me over. So I went from being a person who was out every night doing stand-up to someone who couldn't walk anymore. And earlier in October, days before that happened, actually, I had started doodling this comic strip, basically. And a friend of mine who was sober said, "That's so funny. You should just do something with that. Just like launch it. Enough sober people would like a comic to read, so you should do it." So I had thought of Sober Rabbit as kind of a one-off, sort of like Far Side, sort of strip about sobriety, like one panel, like very simply drawn. And then I went to having to sit because of my broken foot and broken body. And so what started out as a comic that I updated once a week turned into a comic that I updated 3 days a week. And now I have a Patreon, and now I have an LLC, and now I am a full-time artist, kind of by necessity. But basically the germ of the idea was I was reading all these recovery memoirs. I was obsessively watching the Craig Ferguson sobriety monologue. I don't know if you've seen that one.
I have seen it. It's very good. Yes.
Oh, I love it.
Yes.
But so I was absorbing like all this recovery stuff, and it just stuck out to me that like no one really talks about the boring, like, okay, now you go to a meeting, maybe you try some yoga, maybe you meditate. There's that lovely book by Leslie Jameson, The Recovering, that talks about when a lot of famous artists got sober and then like what happened to them. And it's real sad. But there's not really a lot that I found anyway about staying sober. And so that's what I wanted to write about. And so I came up with something that was easy to draw, a rabbit. That a white rabbit works in black and white. And then I came up with Rabbit's friend, Brenda, who is a big anxious pigeon. So Rabbit is kind of small and depressive, and Brenda is big and anxious. And then I just sort of filled out this world of who are the animals that they would know. What are meetings like for these little animals? Like, what are their coping mechanisms? And they're pretty personified. They're anthropomorphic, whatever. I don't know what the right word is, but they're like people, but they're basically these little animals, dealing with addiction like we do as humans.
I mean, it's so there was no artwork prior to the Sober Rabbit. You were not an illustrator prior to that.
That's one of those wonderful gifts of sobriety. I was hammered for so long that as a theater actor and as a stand-up comedian, it's fairly cut and dry to be like, I will think of these words and then stand maintaining an art practice during active addiction wasn't something that I really stuck with. I had the brief
Right.
time of I won a grant, I opened an art gallery, I drank away all of the grant money. And so I just couldn't get my shit together enough to sit down and draw. But when I was a little kid, what I wanted to be was a cartoonist. And so it really took full circle sobriety and now disability to, you know, settle me down. And I've had really funny old timers in the program be like, yeah, like you getting crippled and getting back to your art is a God moment. And I'm just like, that's a little offensive, but also maybe they're kind of right that it took this whole long, painful journey to get me to sit down and draw, you know?
Do
I
you,
don't
I
know.
mean, yeah. Does it feel that way to you ever, or?
Sometimes, because the stuff that what I'm finding with the comic is the stuff that I think that is the most embarrassing and basic and painful. That's the stuff that people go, oh yeah, that I feel that way. And I'm just like, are you kidding me? Like, because, you know, I'm sure that all artists have that feeling of like something that you write is personal and embarrassing and horrible turns out to be universal. And that's why people like it, because they relate to it. So yeah, so I only had a couple of doodles. And then once I was seated on the couch for months ahead of time, that's when I really got rolling with, oh, this could be a longer story, you know?
So the accident happened early in sobriety.
Mm-hmm.
And then in that recovery process, was there ever any thoughts of relapse or drinking again or anything of that nature?
Yeah, totally. When I was suddenly pulled away from stand up because I literally couldn't stand up anymore, it was a huge shift in my recovery and also just in my day to day because I was, I guess, I guess I'd hit 3 years when that happened. And so I was someone who had built up this huge recovery social life of going to meeting, getting coffee with sober people, you know, kind of sponsee stuff all the time. And then stand up and then my full-time job. And so I was just a very active person. And so all of a sudden, when I couldn't go to my coping mechanism meetings anymore, it was a huge blow. And the harder thing that is true and should be said, even though I hate it, is I lost a lot of friends. There's a lot of people who sort of were like my drinking buddies, you know, who were in my wider orbit, but they weren't really the type that would, you know, help you out if you had a flat, you know, or anything like that. And so it was tough to realize as an adult, like, oh no, I don't have as many friends as I thought I did. And that was something that, you know, in tandem with needing to occasionally take painkillers for my crushed foot, like, oh crap, like I'm isolated, I'm miserable, I'm pissy, no one cares, you know, like the spiral of shame and misery started again. And I had to really catch myself and not just go to limp to the liquor store or wheel myself over there, you know.
Right.
It was rough.
Yeah, I've always been concerned about things like painkillers, and I think I also got a prescription for some sort of Valium because I had to take an MRI, which I didn't want to take, and then I couldn't do the MRI because I'm super claustrophobic, because turns out, you know, memories of my father pinning me down and, you know, wrestling with me and thinking it was funny that I couldn't get up as a child.
Oh sure.
And I'm like, oh shit, is that why I can't do the MRI, that I need to understand what's wrong with my body? And I'm like, oh god damn it, do I take the Valium? Like, I don't want to take the Valium. So like all that insanity, and first thing in the morning.
Yeah.
But also I had a minor surgery in I got a vasectomy in 2018.
Oh, good for
And
you.
thank you. Yes, I think it's the best thing, especially with things that are going on right now in the world, and the abortion laws in Texas and everything else. I think it is by far, aside from getting sober, it's the second best thing I have ever done. And I can't suggest it enough to any guys out there who like, yeah, I mean, I wrote a whole essay about it for Mishka's class. and then had to read it in front of a bunch of academic Yale people.
Love
and
it.
then later when I was talking to him, I think it was an email, and I was like, oh my God, there was all this really painful, dramatic stuff being read, and these people are pouring their hearts out. And I went, all mine was a 3-page dick joke. He's like, my entire career has been a dick joke, John. It's fine. It went over really well. So, but they gave me pain pills and I didn't want to take them. So I didn't. And so I always think about that. Like, when you talk about taking pain pills for the pain, I don't want to be one of these people obviously when it's too much, you have to, because you have to get through, not even get through life, get through the day, get through the next hour, try to get some sleep. Right. So, I don't know what my question is in there other than, how do you manage pain medication when you actually need it as a sober person?
Right. Right. Well, that's, it's funny, when I was in the emergency room after being hit by a car, it's funny, in Chicago, they just kind of weren't impressed because it wasn't gun violence, so they're like, oh, you're hit by a car, that's normal. The whole reaction in the ER was very cavalier. And so they were like, well, I don't know, like, we can give you opioids. And I was just sort of like, addict, no. And pills were never in particular my problem. They also weren't not my problem. You know what I mean?
Yes,
and so
I do.
was like,
yes,
wink,
I
wink,
do.
Nudge, nudge. So at the time, I refused those kinds of painkillers. And I think now, in retrospect, that was a little bit to my detriment. I think I was a little too afraid of, like, I would werewolf out and then suddenly relapse. And now it's a long story, but basically because of bad health coverage, because of the type of insurance that the woman who hit me had, because of COVID delaying a lot of stuff, my foot hasn't healed. And it turns out that I have post-traumatic arthritis, which is a whole different ballgame than what it started as. I thought that I had a broken foot that wasn't getting better. Turns out my bones are dust. It's more like osteoarthritis, basically, and there's no fix for it. So I am now dealing with chronic pain, and that is where I am having to be very cautious about being prescribed opioids, about like developing an addiction to anything. I really have to think about it. And I am not at this moment taking any pain pills. The only time that I've done that in sobriety was some gnarly dental surgeries where I pretty much had to. But it's interesting because chronic pain management is a whole new ballgame for me. And I've met a lot of people who use medical marijuana to feel better. And I've changed my perspective on that. I previously was a very hardcore abstinence only kind of person. And I've met people who have debilitating illnesses, that they take CBD for, and they take THC stuff. I tried a THC lotion on my foot just experimentally to see if that would help. Doesn't get you high, made my foot feel tingly. That was it. But I say that to stress that I had this certain idea of what sobriety was. And now that I'm in the chronic pain management community, it's different. Some people use opioids responsibly. Some people use stuff like morphine and all these things that, when I was a teenage dirtbag, I was like, I'll ingest that. Like, let's go. Are you kidding me? And so, I'm very new to starting this stuff. I'm going to be, probably leg brace, wheelchair is where I'm bound. But it's different. And it's something that I run by sober people a lot when I question it, and I even have this wonderful community of chronic illness, chronic pain sober people that I can talk to. So, I just have to accept help and then also be realistic about my limitations.
Yeah. I mean, it's definitely something just within the past year that I have come to. I mean, I'm a little more lax about what I think sobriety is, not in well, it's about the intention, right? It's about what is my intention? Is my intention to just get high, then there might be an issue there. Is it irritable, restless, and discontent, and I just want relief? Right. So am I using a drug to get relief? Well, what kind of relief is it, John? Is it relief from not working your program, or is it relief from something that is actually wrong in your body that you need to not feel for the next couple of hours so that you can enjoy life in some way, so that you can do the thing that actually takes away those feelings of irritable, restless, and discontent? So I think that's kind of, I have a friend who, considers himself sober, but he is THC, CBD, all that stuff, but he doesn't drink and doesn't do anything else. And I'm like, that's great for him, and I continue to meet people that have these other ideas about sobriety. And I'm like, well, I really respect what they do and how they manage themselves. And so far be it for me to be I'm going to gatekeep recovery and sobriety. Like, no, absolutely not. So
it's so individual, and that's something that I try and toe the line with in the comic, because I like to talk about stuff related to, is this something that you're using medicinally, or is this something that you're using recreationally? And it can be harmful. There's a lot of pop culture instances of this, like the Demi Lovato documentary recently, where they use marijuana instead of drinking, I think, or instead of heroin or something. And a lot of sober people argue this is harmful because, or this is useful because. And so I try to inject the comic with some of those discussions because I find them fascinating. I want to know what other people have to say about what they think sobriety is. And I also just always want to hear what helps other people, so I try and be respectful about it in the comic, but it is something that I push a little bit because it's something that's interesting to me,
And again, with the going back to the comic, excuse me, I think what draws me in is some of the, I don't want to use the word, not boring, but the like there's all this little minutia that we all go through every single day, and we just kind of don't talk about it because it is the minutia, and it's just do the little things. And so when I'm reading this comic, I'm going, I relate to that because those are the same thoughts that I had. Again, going back to that, oh yeah, that's what everybody thinks. It's not the private, dark, embarrassing, boring thing. It is this universal experience of just living life. And then having that, well, I'm going to have to be sober on top of it.
Yeah. Well, thank you. That's so kind to say that, that you relate to it. Because for me, some of the hardest adjustments have been the little things, of, I have to meditate now. That's a thing that I have to do. And like a 16-year-old me would just be like rolling, you meditate, you huge wuss. You have to take time out of you meditate. But the reality is that if I do the little sober things like meditating, tending to my little apartment garden, if I call another alcoholic instead of be insane, I feel better, and while there's a big sea changes, like maybe you do lose your friend group, and maybe you don't continue that line of work, and maybe you don't continue that relationship, maybe you move, there are big adjustments in sobriety. The little adjustments are good too, like they can be life changing if you do little self-care things.
Yeah. What do you think is, like, right now, what is your biggest, or do you have, like, what is your biggest struggle in sobriety today, or with it?
I think it's related to that. I think it's, I feel like since day one of sobriety, I've been saying that trying to find a healthy balance in everything is really hard for me. I'm someone who is very intense. I'm a very big perfectionist. Even now, even when I know that that's silly and no one gives a shit, and I'm imparting like all these like concepts on myself that I would never judge other people by. That's the struggle for perfection, whatever that is really difficult. And it's something that I'm actively combating by drawing my crappy little of like, it is not, I will say, and I'm not fishing for compliments, it's not the best drawn, it's not the most finished, but I'm putting it out, I'm putting it out every week as best I can. And so that's something that I'm working on. I also deal with, and this sucks, but it's something that in the way that when you go to a meeting and you're like, I don't want to talk about this is probably the thing that you should talk about. I struggle a lot with professional jealousy, with a lot of, and not just that, but like the idea that I'm behind in doing all these things. And by having this big active addiction that I missed out, or that, and that isn't real. And I know it isn't real, but the pandemic really, really put a stop to a lot of stuff that I was doing. And like everybody, I'm not special. So there's just been a lot of kind of recalibrating and reshifting in the past couple months and years, and now I am I'm disabled now, so that's another big layer and filter on top of everything, so the mobility stuff is big and new for me, and the feeling like I'm not doing enough is big. And I think that all of that just sort of could be summed up with balance. Gotta find balance.
Yeah, for sure. It's constant, like, is this enough? Is this too much? Can I do this? What should I do? Did I squander last week? Okay. Oh, now I'm stressed out about today. Can I forgive myself for squandering yesterday? Was it really a squander? Can I just enjoy myself and be at peace for a moment? And I think too, that's where the things like meditation can come in and help, and that I probably should have done a little bit more of that prior to my MRI. I would have probably been a little more okay in the tube. But what I think the last question I want to ask you is, what advice would you give to somebody who's listening and, is thinking about sobriety or interested in it in some way or fashion?
I would say if it's something that you're curious about, it's okay to dip your toe in a little bit. I'm someone who still very much is a victim to black and white thinking of I have to be entirely sober. I can't just work out a little. I have to be an Olympian. I'm very extreme in my thinking. And the reality is that you got to do what's best for you. And if you're curious about something like recovery, check it out. Read a book, listen to a podcast, watch the Craig Ferguson sobriety monologue. It's so good. But no, I would just say it doesn't have to be an overnight thing. You don't have to change your life overnight. And for me, it took years of thinking about quitting. And the only regret that I have now, really, if I'm honest, is that I didn't try a meeting sooner. Because I think I built quitting up to be this huge monumental, I have to tell everyone, I have to shout it from the mountaintops. And you can if you want to. I did, but you don't have to, So I would just say, if you're somebody who thinks that you have a problem with drugs or alcohol, you might, of the people that I've talked to, I'm not sure that people who aren't addicts think those thoughts, but, I wish I would have explored it. I wish I would have dipped my toe in, and I wish I would have accepted help earlier. So I would just also stress that there's so much help out there. It doesn't seem like it. And especially if you're embarrassed and penniless and everybody's mad at you and you're mad at you, it's so ugly to be like, hey, can you help? But it can change your life if you just say, can you pick me up? Let's go, let's give it a shot. And it did for me anyway. Just saying, I am in trouble with myself and I need help, changed my life.
Yeah, asking for help. And I know that it's such a big thing. Even, and you also mentioned something, you said something about going to extremes, black and white thinking, and it's got to be all or nothing. And I was at the physical therapist, and she was having me do these like hamstring pulls or stretches, and she's like, I guess she was looking at my face, and she says, "You're grimacing, John. Are you somebody who, obviously you need to stretch more." That was the big takeaway. But she said, "Are you somebody who tries to go and, go further and do as much as possible?" And I just blurted out, I said, "Yeah, as a recovering alcoholic, it's kind of like my thing." That wasn't, it wasn't, I didn't even mean for that to come up as part of the conversation. She's there to, that's not her expertise, but we just got into a conversation about it. And I said, "Yes, I've always been extreme. And so that's part of this." And she said, "Well, if you want to stretch these things, and you need to, and if you want to, the part of what's causing you the pain is that you need to be more flexible." And I was like, "Okay." And she's like, "Take it a little at a time. You don't have to do it all today. In fact, you can't. So don't try." And so that was sort of like this, to me, it was like, "Oh, okay, I don't have to do it all today. So don't even try." I was like, "Oh my God, what a relief." So, and I kind of correlated that to my sobriety,
a little bit every day, a little bit.
Yeah. So where can people find the Sober Rabbit?
They can find the Sober Rabbit on Instagram. I post to Facebook and Instagram. And so on Instagram.com/Sober Rabbit, Facebook.com/Sober Rabbit Comic. And then if anybody wanted links to my stores or Patreon, or even just some behind the scenes drawing type stuff, you can go to soberrabbit.com to find everything related to me.
Awesome. It's such a great comic, and it really does resonate with me and obviously a lot of people. So thank you for talking. Thank you for sharing, honestly. And it was really nice to meet you. And I'm looking forward to Sober Rabbit comics in the future.
Oh, thank you so much, John. And thanks to Mishka for hooking us up. That's so nice.
Yes.
Thanks again for listening. Our music, as always, is by Neglect. You can find more of his stuff at neglect.bandcamp.com.
And you can find us on all social media platforms that matter: Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. And you can reach us at aisforalcoholic@gmail.com.
Talk to you later.
Yeah.